Our last speaker for today is Don Taylor from Duke University, who is going to be discussing again in our behavioral track, looking at these systems, a patient-centered discussion of the economics of end of life. Thank you, Don.
Yes, so today's been super interesting and I've learned so much. And actually, I've learned how little I think at my job, and I'm a professor. So it's just the constant response to all the problems. So that actually is a problem, I think. But I realize it's at the end of the day, so maybe I'll go through some of this a little quicker. But I just want to say I'm going to offer basically a policy solution, and that's a bold thing to try to do. But I want to say I think the best hope of moving from low value care to higher value care, however we define low or high value, is to follow patients there. We will not normatively ever come up with some list of we're never going to do this and always going to do that. We will. That won't happen politically and culturally. So figuring out what it means to have a patient-centered understanding of this is where we have to try to get to. And I'm going to just sort of offer a suggestion. And obviously, I think the premise is we don't really have a patient-centered discussion of the economics of end of life. I think about things in terms of money, but everybody, the stories that have been discussed today, which are real human stories, could be quantified in money, or you could put them back out of money either way. But we're talking about resource use and how we care for people and what the impacts are going to be on individual patients, but also also the families. So I think the biggest shift is that we need a prospective way of thinking about not just prognosis, but function and what's important to patients and how those important aspects of their lives are nested within families. And we have to get to what I would call a descriptive and not a normative perspective of this. So for example, if you go to people have talked about the IOM report in the 1990s, they popularized the phrase of a good death, right? So I actually happen to agree with a lot of how they describe a good death, but it's a very normative idea. It sounds like you're telling people what they should do. If you look at the IOM report in 2014, they really kind of changed the language up a lot, and they talk a lot about patient-centeredness. Now, the key is how can you live into that in a policy situation? And basically, if we're talking about economics, like of the Medicare program or the economy or the healthcare system, you have to acknowledge the median, what actuaries think about the median, but investigate the tails. So we're never going to have a one-size-fits-all set of options. And I actually think there's a reasonable chance we could construct a policy construct that could move the median while allowing the tails to have choice and freedom, and even to do things that a lot of us might think are bad ideas. And a key thing, though, is we have to develop the evidence and actually learn how to feed the evidence back quicker. Like, what is the actual prognosis and what is the uncertainty? We have to learn how to communicate the uncertainty. Like, it's a really hard thing, the science of communicating to people whose mother is dying. And you have to realize you don't get to do 1,000 trials of your mother's death to learn how to do it. You only get to do it once. And actually, then once your mother has died, you're lost to the system. So there's actually a learning problem, where the people that are actually expert at navigating the system, when their mother dies, they're gone out of the system. And so is there a way to build back in some of that experience to help both give meaning to the person who's lost a loved one, but also to help the system learn how to communicate prospectively to families and patients. And there will be some policy change required, and I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So if we're talking about end of life, we think in terms of iceberg, and there's stuff above the water like the Medicare costs. We've seen projections of the trust fund, how much Medicaid costs. These are the things that people know about and denominate. But in one sense, the news is actually tons worse than the Medicare trust fund, because there are these huge costs that are below the water, so to speak, and are opaque, hard to measure. They essentially function almost like a tax on people whose parents happen to dwindle as opposed to die quickly. That's a very economist way of thinking about it. But in one sense, a key, I think, in terms of how to make something like the Medicare program more sustainable is actually to make the pie bigger and increase the discussion and learn to actually have discussion about trade-offs between medical care and these parts of the system that are unfunded. So for example, a very sort of cliche caregiving approach is a 55-year-old woman who's going to care for her mother who's 82, okay? So if the 55-year-old woman's engaging in market work, she's at the highest earning point of her career most likely. If she takes 3 years off, she will never actuarially make up the missed retirement savings. So then all of a sudden you just intergenerationally transmitted a type of inequality that came because this person's mother needed to be cared for, and the system really didn't have a way of addressing that. So the point here is there's so many problems up here. In one sense, the problems are even worse down here, perhaps. So above the iceberg, let's just say the Medicare program, there's a big retrospective cost-focused problem that's already been talked about today. The ditty of 1 in 4, Medicare dollars are spent in the last year of life, but you only know when the last year of life, started when it stopped. So it's very hard to do anything with that information. Another tremendous issue is a cultural barrier about what is viewed as a legitimate means of public policy. So is the 55-year-old worker supposed to care for her mother? And maybe we might even say yes, but we might also say it's best for everybody if we learn how to better support that type of activity. So I won't belabor this, but this has been talked about maybe by 2 or 3 different people today already, but this is just showing that $1 in 4, or actually a little bit more, have been spent by the Medicare program last year of life for 40 years. We know this, we say it. It actually, in and of itself, it's hard to even know what it means. It's very consistent. It's actually pretty similar across countries. So the fraction of money spent in healthcare systems just before death is more similar than different. It's just the prices paid in the U.S. are so much higher, and we give such a larger proportion of our economy to healthcare. So it just makes it, in one sense, you can think of it as the system that we have constructed is just less sustainable than the one in other nations. But if we went to England, where they spend, we spend about $2.50 per capita every time they spend one, they still are worried about affording it. So every country is very worried about healthcare costs. So the biggest problem is with this retrospective perspective is you've called out a problem, but you don't really have a way to fix it. You've got to do something prospectively. So I want to tell you guys about a study that we've done, and then I'll end with a planned study that we've had that would be a sort of, I think of it as a small pebble of evidence that might someday lead to a bridge across a creek to a better policy on the other side. So we had a study where that was funded by NIH, where we enrolled patients at Duke who had advanced cancer and their caregivers, and we asked them, if you could not have everything that the Medicare benefit package covered, what would you pick? We put them under a pretty severe resource constraint. And we actually, and this is theoretical, so it's very important. So everything I'm about to say to you, these are things people said. It didn't impact the actual care they got. So this was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology in, 2014. So a mismatch. And we claim that these results, these theoretical results, suggest a mismatch between what's important to elderly people, Medicare beneficiaries and their loved ones, and what the program actually covers. So we had a process where we used a process called Choosing Health Plans Altogether. And it's a visual, I won't go too much detail to the study, but there's a lot of information given to these folks, but they were given, there are 82 dots here, and they got 50 stickers. So they were never told this was money, but it was actuarially determined. And people were said, you can deploy these 50 stickers any way you want, and they deployed them, as they did. If they picked all the level of cancer treatment, it took 42 of the 50 stickers. So you could think of that, an economist might say that's a corner solution, meaning it's a solution that's really hard for anybody to pick in sort of a choice theoretic approach, because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm firing all my bullets, so to speak, in cancer. But it should be said, this level of cancer treatment is paid for de facto by the Medicare program. So, and we had over 500 patients do this, and we had 2 people out of 500 pick all levels of cancer treatment. Now, so that means that 2 out of about 500 said they would pick this if they had a choice, but in fact, that's the level of financing of cancer care that the Medicare program does, without even asking questions. Now, you have to really, I just want to say this really clearly, you have to be really careful not to overinterpret this, because it's theoretical, and in the Medicare program and in the culture, we don't ever show anybody a constraint like this. That's just, yes. 200 out of 500 or 2 people, 2 humans, 2 people. And so what we did further, just to go a little more detail, they did an individual choice where people decided for themselves. Then we put people into small groups, and they talked to each other, and they made a consensus choice. Then the entire group, say 10 to 12 people, made a group consensus choice. And then the individuals did it again individually. And so we look and see, so for example, at the end we ask them questions. So sometimes you have people really important to folks who had individual views that were different than the group views. People at the end were more likely to say things like, I would be willing to abide by what the group said they would pick, even if it differed from what I said, if I felt like I was listened to by the group. And so what you do, if you go through and look at these sessions, as you might imagine, they're human beings. Some of them were better than others. Some of them, you had good discussions. Sometimes you had a bully in the group. Sometimes people were passive and disengaged. These are people. But it was a chance to try to get them discussing. Now, what we did to make this even more difficult is we added 3 types of benefits that the Medicare program doesn't include. We offered them cash, so they could take an actuarially determined amount of money and take cash and do anything they wanted with it. Second, they could have concurrent palliative care, which means you can think of it as hospice-like services before they had unelected curative treatments. So we could think of, we're not going to give people cash almost certainly in the Medicare program, right? We're not going to do that. But we actually probably are likely to do something like concurrent palliative care. That's something that's more plausible. Then there's a middle ground, which I think is the most important thing. We offered them the option of taking essentially less in medical treatments in return for flexible money to construct a home-based care plan for themselves. So we gave them these 3 options of things that weren't covered. So my point there is we already gave them a resource constraint that nobody is given in the Medicare program. And second, we made it even more difficult by adding these other things. But its key is this is a study about hard trade-offs. This wasn't just you can have 2 cherries on top of your sundae. I mean, everybody would say I'll take something on top. These were about trade-offs, hard trade-offs. And so these are the extra benefits, that we offered. And really the way because the cancer treatments are so big actuarially, it ends up being a trade between less of that for more of these flexible benefits. So what we found is that 18% of the participants chose some level of all 3 of these non-traditional benefits. And so they allocated a mean of 15 out of 50 stickers. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude, to go from intermediate to high cancer care is 7. So people were moving fairly large amounts of money, this is an average effect, towards these non-traditional benefits. You might think of them as, we call them often high-touch, low-tech kind of benefits. One thing, African Americans were almost twice as likely as people who were white to make this choice. This is about a quarter of our participants in the study were black, and so it was that was a big goal of this study. I mean, we're in the South, we're in North Carolina, we're trying to enroll a group of people that look like the people that go to Duke, and we did a pretty good job at that. We had to work very hard to do this. If you take these items on one-offs, between 40 and 50% of the beneficiaries pick some level of these uncovered treatments. So, I think you can measure preferences in this way. You could conclude this is some evidence, or at least echoes or beginnings of evidence, that people are really interested in quality of life as opposed to only life extension, which could be thought of as one of the key sort of selling factors of engaging in sort of more aggressive therapies for cancer. But also, as I've said now multiple times, this is theoretical choices. We actually, I'll tell you in a second, we're actually trying to find a way to do a study on one cancer diagnosis about this. So a big question. If you listen to we recorded these events, and when I say the events, these discussions, and if you listen to them, it's really interesting. Some of them went bad. Sometimes there was a bully in the group of sorts, and those groups were not so great. But people listen to each other in this, and they had give and take. And this discussion was not theoretical for these folks. The study ended in early 2014. Almost every patient who was in the study is dead today. So, this was not a theoretical, like if we went to a mall, we could have an intake cohort and ask people about trade-offs, and we could get a bunch of 30-year-olds to say, we could get them to say, I'd rather quality of life is so much important than life extension. And we'd say, well, we also know then later, once they are ready for that life state, their minds will change. These are people who are really directly facing their own mortality. It was not a theoretical issue at all for them. They actually were ready to go to the hard place, to the hard choices, because I think that's where they were. They didn't have any choice but to go there. But figuring out how in the world we would have a national conversation like this, it seems very difficult. Somebody's mentioned death panels and things of that nature. So it's a big challenge of how would we ever get to this? How would we ever imagine a policy choice where people would even listen and imagine letting us try something like this? And I think the answer to that is we have to have evidence that it can be, done in a way that doesn't hurt people. Yes?
Before we go on
Yeah.
the slide, I'd love to ask 2 questions.
Yep.
The first is, what if any distress did the participants of this study who
Yes.
were being asked to
Yes.
think about these really hard trade-offs?
Yes.
Did they have a higher level of distress through their cancer journey when they weren't experiencing that in their actual clinical setting? And you see what I mean?
So, there were 2 adverse events during the study that were both related to extreme anxiety.
I'm just
Is that what you?
wondering if they're telling you in this study that
Yes.
they would like to trade off and have more time or less aggressive care because they wanted to create this home
Yes.
thing, and they're going to their oncologist and they're going full court press,
Yes.
was there distress in that at all that was understood? And then the second one was, did having this policy conversation with people change? Did you go back and look at all in doing this study, and did it change the conversations or
Right.
the course of therapy choices in the actual clinical environment?
Yes. So there's 3. I'm going to call 3 questions there. There was one pretty extreme adverse event during the event where somebody basically realized that they were dying and they really had not before, and the study had an on-call psychiatrist, and the one in one of the events that support system had to be invoked and the session was stopped. And there was another sort of next day fairly serious adverse event, a similar type. In terms of whether it altered the conversations, we don't have good insight with that. This study was really hard to do, and this will sound like I'm being negative with my colleagues, but in oncology at Duke, there weren't many undecided docs about this study. They were either like, get that shit out of here, that is not what we do at Duke, or they were like, man, we should be doing this kind of stuff. And so a worry about the study then is if there's a sorting of patients into oncologists, which is easy to imagine. That's why I say we have to get some evidence of whether somebody can actually do this. Here's another thing that'll sound like I'm being negative about Duke, which I love working at Duke. The patients consented to us linking back to their actual data on treatments, but there's both a human subject issue, but Duke internal money types think there's a business sort of secrets issue, roughly speaking. I've said that too bluntly. It's not exactly what they say, but we've had troubles actually carrying out that part of the study that patients have consented to, but the vice president of saying no, whoever that might be, or that we have a lot of them at Duke, or don't want us to do some of that. That makes sense? So the point is, there's some, I didn't get into it, there's some standard gambles we put these folks through where you ask them a bunch of theoretical trade-offs at the beginning where the expected value is the same for both arms. And if they pick all 4 of one, you could say they're a quality of life lover, and all 4 of another, you could say they're a life extension lover, and then you could see what they said in the choice, and then you could look at what care they've got. So we have IRB approval to do all that, but we've as yet to be able to put it all together. So that's not a happy part of the story. Yeah. So let me tell you about this. This is actually the last slide I've got, and then we're going to have a conversation. We've been looking for, we have to have a clinical champion to do this. And Matt Harker's here, my colleague. I mean, we're thinking about this all the time. And I was randomly playing golf one day, and I played into this group, and me and this guy started talking, and this guy happened to be a big oncologist at Duke, and I was telling him about this, and he's like, oh, we need to do something like that. So anyway, we found 2 oncologists who are experts in ovarian cancer. And we have conceptually agreed to, and we're trying to figure out a way to fund it, the following study: platinum-resistant ovarian cancer with at least 1 sentinel event. And Duke's got a lot of data that suggests in those situations, survival to 6 months is 9%. And then they have some experimental therapies, randomized some experimental therapies that are being offered. And the other arm of the study would be essentially an actuarially determined account with a concierge-based home care company to come and set up a home care plan for the patient. So it's even more complicated because some of the oncologists say we have to do a randomized trial. So it's got to be, I'm just going to euphemistically call it last-ditch chemo or home-based caregiving. Because if we don't do a trial, people will never believe it, and that's the standard of the evidence. There's some other docs that say, no, it's the opposite. We have to study the selection effect, because there will be a selection effect in the trial, because whoever consents to the trial has already imagined being down both of the arms if they've understood the trial, right? So there's a selection effect already. So we need to offer it to multiple patients and actually study the selection effect, in part because let's imagine, so I'll tell you, I'm a researcher, a professor, so that means I'm about the evidence, but someday I'll be a Medicare beneficiary unless I die untimely young, right? So I'm 49, so when I'm 69 and I'm a Medicare beneficiary, I would like it to be the case that we have flexibility in how patients consume their Medicare entitlement, and that we would undertake probably a disease by disease perspective where we try to learn the evidence, learn how to communicate it, offer choices like this, see what patients do, feed it back, and just assume that mistakes will be made. There'll be people with regret, but there are people with regret today, and learn how to talk about this. And the only way to really talk about it, I think, is to go ahead and put essentially the money of the Medicare, trust fund at risk. I mean, it's a really high stakes thing to do. and it's, right now we're saying we want to try to fund a study to do, 25 or 30 patients with ovarian cancer. We've gone to NIH. They're actually quite interested in this, surprisingly enough. But they say you have to have preliminary data. So, but all of what I just said, these are some of the, we've got to learn how to communicate prognosis with the uncertainty, and build in function as well, because these are, if we're talking about patient-centered, I think often the function. I'm just thinking of, I'll just tell you a quick vignette. So my 93-year-old grandmother died of heart failure last August 29th, and she got a pacemaker 5 weeks before that. So this is a terrible, terrible, terrible outcome retrospectively. And I'm supposed to be an expert, right, in end of life and stuff. So it's a very humbling story, really. I mean, it's a terrible story. But I was actually playing golf. So there's another theme in the talk, right? I like to play golf. So my phone was in my car, and I come back to my phone, and there's like 8 or 9 texts from my mother. And she's saying, Mama she passed out. She had a caregiver. The caregiver kind of panicked and called 911. And so she's, blazing off into the ER. And they get there, and there's somebody that wants to give her a pacemaker. And my mother asked the doc, can we wait? I'd like to talk to my son, and can we maybe wait until Monday to decide? This is on a Saturday afternoon. And the doc said, your mother might be dead by Monday, which is of course true, because my grandmother's 93 with end-stage heart failure, and she had a DNR. So, but she was kind of a rambunctious. She was a tobacco farmer's wife. So when she got to the hospital, she actually walked into the hospital that day. She's like, leave me, that kind of thing. And so, and my point here is mobility and walking was really important to her. She never walked another day in her life. So the only thing that the pacemaker in the end really did was mean that she never took another step. So, I mean, if you want to talk about, I'm not sure exactly how to measure low value, high value, but that's pretty low value. And so, and my point there is listen to patients, and function's really, really important. We have to devise these plausible policy trade-offs. We're going to try to do this in one tiny little sliver study. But the only way I know to really do this is to try to study it and build the evidence. And it's not only got to be the impact on the patients, it's got to be the impact on the family and the caregivers. It's actually also got to be the impact on the docs, right? So our oncologists, friends are saying, we've got to understand what the docs here in the clinic, think about this. Are they willing to do something like this? Are they willing to offer, well, we could do this line of chemo, or, you could have home-based sort of caregiving. And this is not hospice. Like down the caregiving path, somebody could choose hospice or not, but I mean, a good hospice is probably going to come maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 times a week. This is caring that's going to allow like the 55-year-old to keep working and not be worried that her mother is falling down the back steps while she's at work, those kind of things. Maybe let's stop. You guys have heard a lot of things said to you today, so we could just have a discussion or answer questions.